guys, welcome back. I'm going to be doing something a little bit different today. I've had some requests recently for more information about what goes on at each stage in the process when I create an illustration, and particularly like how many layers and how do I add on the layers and those sorts of things. So I thought it would be a good opportunity to make a more detailed video. So I'm going to be doing what is kind of my typical process, my most minimal process. I shouldn't say typical because I really don't have a typical process, but this is a process that a lot of my pieces were created with, and it's of all of the techniques that I use in the different combinations of media, this one's probably the most minimal. It's just watercolor paper and just a regular number 2 pencil, any sort of pencil that you want, and eraser to do the sketch. And then for the main materials, we're going to be using the watercolor, water-soluble pencils and the soft core colored pencils, and then just for a little bit of detail and highlight at the end, we'll be using a black Sharpie paint pen and a white Sharpie paint pen. And that's it. So let's go ahead and get started. So to begin with, I'm creating a sketch. Since it's a fairly simple subject, there's not really a lot of complicated things to figure out in the composition. I'm just doing my sketch right on the watercolor paper. The most important thing to figure out initially is the basic proportion between the height and the width of the subject. So that's what I'm doing with this piece of paper here. And once I've got that nailed down, which in this case it's about a 1-to-1 ratio between the height and the width, then I can start describing the actual structure of the piece. As I do this, I'm really just focusing on the big shapes and the big proportions and trying not to get bogged down in the details. Once the basic shape is all set, I can start adding in the details, which in this case, most of the details are in the wrapper. The top of the muffin is actually pretty simple, so most of my time in the sketching phase will be spent creating the structure of the wrapper, making sure I get all those little folds and nooks and crannies where they're supposed to be, since that will really help create the illusion of realism once the piece is done. For the top of the muffin, I'm adding in a few little hints, like a map for myself about where the darkest parts are and where the lightest parts are, which will make it easier for me to figure that out when it comes time to color. So that's the sketch done. Now it's on to the first layer of color, which is done with watercolor pencils. These can be used lots of different ways, but the way that I'm using them in this application is just adding them directly to a dry paper the same way you would with any sort of colored pencil or crayon. I started by blocking off the area where the lightest lights were going to be, just to make sure that I didn't go over that with anything darker later on, because it's always easier with this sort of application to add more dark colors than it is to add more light colors at the end, which is counterintuitive if you're used to working more with oils or acrylics. Once I've got the lightest light part blocked off and set aside, then I start adding in more of the medium tones that are going to make up the majority of the piece. Since this is just the initial layer of color and this is all going to get blurred out when I blend it in with water, I really don't get too concerned with the details. It's similar to what happened in the sketch phase. I'm mostly just focusing on the big areas and big blocks of color. And even in the areas that are eventually going to get really dark later on, I'm pretty careful to keep those more at a mid-tone or a dark mid-tone, like the blueberries, for example, which will be really, really dark towards the end. Initially, I want to keep them not too dark because I don't want this to get muddy when I blend it out. For the wrapper, I go through the same process, adding the mid-tones first and then adding the darker mid-tones while reserving those things that are going to be really, really light, just kind of leaving those untouched. Once I've got the dry water-soluble pencil laid down and ready to go, it's time to blend it out, and of course I'm using water. I really like to use a round brush for this. This is a number 2 round brush. And if I feel like any area is getting too dark, then I'll just kind of take a little piece of paper towel and smudge off some of the color. It's really easy to do while it's still wet. I've mentioned in another video that I really like to use brushes that were intended for acrylic or for oil during the phase of blending out the watercolor pencils because they're really stiff bristles, so they let me kind of smudge that pigment down into the paper and get rid of any unwanted texture that was left from the watercolor pencil. So that's what I'm using here. And you can also notice that I'm going kind of section by section, little bit by little bit. Some people, when they blend out the watercolor pencil, they'll just use a big brush and kind of go over the entire thing, and that's fine, but it really won't preserve very much detail. So for my purposes, I really like going little bit by little bit, and that helps me keep at least some of the shape and the form of the actual subject. Once the watercolor pencil is thoroughly dry, then I will start on what is actually the longest part of the process, the many layers of softcore colored pencil, and this is how I add detail and form to the piece. Similar to the initial layer with watercolor pencils, I start out with the midtones. It's always really tempting for me to go right for the darkest darks or the lightest lights, but I know that if I do that too early, I'll end up muddying the piece. So I really try to force myself to stick to those midtones for quite a while until I have the form of the piece really well described. This color is one that I use a lot, especially when I'm doing baked goods. I think it's the goldenrod yellow. It's a Prismacolor softcore pencil. And it's just like perfect for getting that really kind of nice golden color that a lot of baked goods have. And you'll see me periodically going in with a couple of different light greens, and this is because I feel like that part of a blueberry muffin, that kind of inside part next to the blueberries, ends up having a little bit of a blue-green kind of jadey color to it because of the blueberries. As I'm working on the mid-tone layers, I'm pretty careful not to press too hard with the colored pencils because I want to be able to keep layering on top, and if I press really hard with the colored pencil, I'll smush down the tooth of the paper, which is like the texture of the paper, and that's what allows it to accept the pigment from the colored pencil. So I have to be pretty restrained with myself to make sure I don't press too hard, and I'm just doing these kind of little tiny circular strokes, cycling back and forth between different shades of gold and some siennas and cadmium orange in there as well. This is actually one of my favorite things about colored pencils, is that since you're going gradually and layer by layer, it really allows you to build up the color as you're creating it, as opposed to oil painting, which I used to do a lot of, but really requires you to be pretty good at mixing your paint on the palette, and that's always been a challenge for me. So I love with colored pencil how I can just do the mixing basically as I go. And now you can see I'm finally just starting to add in some of the darker colors where the blueberries are, but still trying to have a relatively light hand with it and going back and forth between the darks and the midtones, because sometimes something that looks really dark initially, once you have all the midtones down accurately, you'll realize that it actually wasn't that dark. So I'm putting some more midtones in here to try to really describe the form of the muffin before I go back into the darkest darks again. I know some people who work with colored pencils really like to develop one area completely before moving on to another area, and if that works for them, that is awesome. But for me, since I do feel like I am much better if I kind of mix gradually as I go, I tend to do kind of layer by layer across the entire piece, saving the really fine details and the darkest darks and the lightest lights until the end. So here I'm just adding that same level of detail that I have up top to the muffin wrapper. And as I'm doing that, really trying to work with the values to build up the form and the shape of those little folds. As I get closer to the end here, I'm finally letting myself start using the really dark colors. I think this is a 90% warm gray, and then I'm also using some indigo in that same area as well. But this has really been reserved just for the very end of the piece, since now that I have all of the midtones pretty well blocked in, I can tell how dark these dark tones really should be. And the same goes for the white. I tend to wait until the very end of the piece to add on those lightest lights, just like I would wait to add in the darkest darks. And even though I'm going to use a paint pen towards the end to add on those really bright highlights, I pretty much always go over the areas that I'm going to be highlighting with white colored pencil as well, since it allows me to blend and add some of the softness that would be there naturally. And whenever I've got those darkest darks and lightest lights in, I inevitably end up seeing more areas where I should develop some detail and add more form. So that's what I'm doing here. And just as it was important in the beginning to really get the structure and the proportions down, the way you're going to communicate three-dimensionality is to have the values, which is the darkness and the lightness of color, to have those really described very accurately. So I always end up spending some time on that at the end, just trying to make sure that it really reflects the shape of the subject. And once all that is finally done, then it's time to add the very darkest darks with the black Sharpie paint pen. And to be honest, I've only just started using this. I don't use it all that much, but I really do like using it for something like this that has the true dark areas. And even then you have to be really careful not to overdo it, which is personally why I don't let myself use it into the end. Is it can just be kind of an easy way out to rely too much on pure black and pure white to describe the form in your subject. So I really am just using tiny little bits of that. And then as you can see here, I'm adding the last little bits of the highlights with the white Sharpie paint pen. And I'm using that to give kind of that sense of shininess in the subject, and also to add highlights to areas where they would definitely naturally have it, like on the sugar crystals and on the muffin wrapper. Once I feel like the piece is done, I step back and evaluate, and then I scan it in, and that's the last step. So that's it. That's my full process, what I would go through to create an illustration using this combination of media. I hope it was helpful. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you're interested in seeing more behind the scenes process and more regular illustration updates, I post every day on Tumblr and on Instagram, so you can follow me there. Both are linked down below. Please let me know if you have any questions or things that weren't quite clear. You can leave those in the comments below. Yeah, and that's it. Until next time, bye. Wow, it is hard to not say the end.